going to talk about point counts. It's one of the most standard methods for understanding bird distributions that we have. There's a lot of papers modeling bird distributions that use point count data. And so it's a useful method to know. There are a lot of different types of point counts, but the things that point counts have in common is that they involve an observer located at a single map latitude, longitude point, and the survey is timed. And the duration of that point count can vary from 3 minutes, which is the duration of a breeding bird survey point count, all the way up to 20 minutes or sometimes longer if the observer is waiting to observe specific types of birds. Your standard duration for a point count is usually somewhere between 3 and 10 minutes for observers looking to document a variety of species or all of the species at an area. And so those are some of the elements that point counts have in common. There are 3 basic types of point counts that can give you different kinds of information. There are unlimited radius point counts that are documenting species, and there's no limit to how far or close the birds are to be counted. And breeding bird surveys, North American breeding bird surveys actually do limit the distance that an observer can count the birds, but many other surveys don't, and they try to eliminate the possibility of double counting individual birds by spacing the points far apart. So using what we call unlimited radius count, so you're not throwing out observations beyond a certain distance, you can say things about relative abundances of birds. You can look at patterns at single points, at a set route of points or a set number of points over time. You can compare those over time pretty well if you have the same observers. And you can say something about species richness. But unlimited radius point counts are fairly limited in their ability to give you estimates of how abundant an organism is in an environment, and certainly can't give you estimates of density, so numbers of individuals per a unit area. And so there are slightly modified forms of your point count that can do that. So one of the simplest ways to control for differences in detection, so this is the big problem with unlimited radius counts, is that if I'm in a thick forest, my ability to see and hear birds is limited because the vegetation is getting in the way, versus if I'm out in a very on open water or in a very open area, my ability to detect birds is much different than it is in a closed area. So, and there's a gradient from very open to very closed to areas that might be very noisy or very quiet, all sorts of things that might influence a single observer's detection ability. And the higher my detection ability, the higher my counts will be, even if the numbers of birds in the good detectability environment are not higher. They might even be lower than in a place with poor detectability. But it's my bias in being able to detect that has an influence. Some other problems can be differences in observers. So when you have multiple observers doing point counts, there may be differences related to the observers that influences the results. And we want to avoid that observer bias, differences in observer bias in what we would find the outcome. So if we, for example, since a person that had impaired ability to detect the birds orally to one type of habitat, maybe it's a habitat with fewer species and so they're less likely to miss things, you're actually influencing the outcome and probably suppressing the numbers even more because there's a difference in the detection ability of that observer compared to others. So one straightforward way that people use to make numbers more comparable at different sites is to do what we call a fixed radius point count. And so the way a fixed radius point count works is, say you are going into an environment and you do some bird surveys across a number of points. So you have a set number of points. and you set a radius, and the radius is set across all the points. Say that we are, I'm going to add a bunch of points. We haven't really talked about sampling in this class, but say you want to compare two habitat types. You want to actually collect a lot of samples in each habitat type. And this is, say this is habitat 1, this is habitat 2, okay? And this is where we're doing our points. Sometimes we walk transects and stop, just like a breeding bird survey. Other times the points might be distributed out. One thing that is held in common with most point count surveys is that there is some minimum distance that we set them. 200 to 500 meters is usually the minimum, and that's to ensure we're not double counting birds. But we're out here, we have these points, and we don't want to double count individuals. We want these points to be what we call independent, and we want them to be comparable to one another. So if this site is just, I'm going to draw lines as trees, is just full of trees and is really thickly, has really thick vegetation in habitat 1, and in habitat 2, it's a much more open environment. My ability to see is, in here, is impaired. The vegetation does absorb sound, and it makes it really hard to see the birds, and so it's really hard to make comparisons. But what I can do is I can set a limit on which birds I'll count, and I can set that by distance. So I can say, okay, well, I've been in these thick habitats, and I'm going to set the distance of my point counts to be about this big, and let's pretend like they're all roughly the same size. Say it's 50 meters or 20 meters, say 50 meters. So anything past 50 meters, I'm not going to count as in. And what I'll do is I'll go out in the environment, and at least for the first few surveys, I'll take like a 50-meter tape and I will flag 50-meter boundaries so that I know what they are, and then I will know where I'm counting my birds in or out. As you get better at it, you can simply make a map of landmarks that are in and out of the 50-meter range, and make sure you're marking only birds that are in. Now you could observe birds at a much further distance here, but you would keep your radius the same size across all the habitats, and it would be limited by the habitat with the lowest detectability rate. That way, you're only counting birds in those close, that are in the same unit of area. And because you have established a radius, you can actually calculate the area of your circle using your pi r squared, and you can extrapolate and say there are this many birds per acre, or this many birds per hectare in my environment, or this many birds per meter squared, whatever unit of area you're using. So that's a fixed radius count, and they're really commonly used, and they're very useful for making comparisons between sites and estimating densities. They can't get to this question of differences in detection. You can also limit your points if you think that certain people can't observe birds from as far away as others for a variety of reasons. You might also set a small point count circle. So, but it's not that great at accounting for that kind of difference in detection. The other thing these fixed radius counts can't really, or the drawback of them is the limitation of your small radius, okay? And so there is this issue of people being present in an environment suppressing birds. Even when we're really quiet, it's very unlikely a bird is actually going to come up to you where it might otherwise, if you're occupying a space where it otherwise might be singing, it may not come into that space. And so there tends to be, when you go out and you are sitting in not sitting, you're standing, you're in an area where you're doing a survey, where you're standing, there is low detectability, okay, even if you're really quiet and unobtrusive. So this is low detectability. And then as you move out, your detectability goes higher. And it goes higher for a couple of reasons. The birds, if you're being very unobtrusive and quiet, it's only going to be very close to you that they may not approach, okay? And as they're further away from you, they'll feel more comfortable. But the other thing is, if you think of the area of a circle, the probability of a bird being present at any one point, I could put 1,000,000 points or infinity points in this circle, and a bird being present at any one specific little point is very small. But as you increase this area of your circle, the probability of detecting these birds, the further and further out you go, is larger because you're basically observing a larger area. And so you have this issue with low detectability as you get closer into your circle. And that can have some unintended influences. But fixed radius point counts are really commonly used, and they're a pretty straightforward way to can account for much of the problems you can see with unlimited radius counts. Another pretty commonly used, or very commonly used, method is called distance sampling. And it's a fancy version of a fixed radius count. And so, or it's almost in between a fixed radius count and an unlimited radius count. And so a distance sampling survey is a point count. So here's me, I'm at my point. Or stick observer, they're at their point. Let's just put the point behind them, say we're laying down on the point. And the observer, actually no, I'll have you standing on the point. The observer can count any bird that they can detect, but they must also, so here's a bird. I'm going to just do the flying birds. Okay, here are birds in the environment. I can detect all of them, or the observer can detect all of them. All they have to do is get an estimate of the straight line distance. So the bird is actually here from, let's do this bird, from the eye of the observer. Okay, but what we really need to get is this distance. Okay, so draw it out a little bit further so it's right underneath this bird. I'm trying to get this radial distance from the bird. Same with this bird. This bird is this far away from me, but I'm really trying to measure this distance. And then this bird is it's basically at 0 because it's right over my head. And then this bird is this distance, okay? So by doing that, when we take these estimates of distance of the bird from the observer, we can start to plot the observer's detection. And so if I were to collect enough of these points, and it doesn't matter what my habitat looks like or what the influence on my detection is, whether it's a noisy environment or it's a windy environment or it's just really thick vegetation, it actually doesn't matter. If I'm very careful at counting all the birds that I can observe and I measure their distances, I can start to plot my detection. And I can do that by generating basically a histogram. And a histogram is a frequency distribution. And so if I think of, say I collect 100 surveys and I look at how many observations I have up to 10 meters, to 20 meters, to 30 meters, to 40 meters, okay, and on. And I can go up to many, many hundreds of meters. Some birds you can hear from a really long way away. I can start to plot the number of observations, so the number of birds, individual birds, that I observed between 0 and 10 meters, between 10 and 20, between 20 and 30, etc. And if I've collected really well, I'll get something that looks like it's going to be low, and then it gets high, and then it trails off. Okay. And so it's going to be something like this. Maybe I've got like this, because I'm sampling a larger area. As I go out, I start to see more birds because I'm sampling more area. Remember the species area effect. And higher here up to 50, and then maybe past 50, the environment starts to actually get hard to see the birds. And it starts to go back down. And by the time I've hit, say, 100 meters, I'm almost at 0 detection. And by plotting that, I get a good idea. I can do some statistics. I can basically generate an estimate of where am I, at what distance am I observing 95% of all of my species. So I can use these numbers to get a mean. So what's the average distance that I was seeing birds? It'd probably be somewhere around here. But then I can use statistics like the standard deviation and standard error to get a 95% confidence interval. And so where are 95% of the detections I got? What distance would I cut that off at? And once you do that, you get a distance that's of which you can find 95% of the detections. Then you can set your fixed radius. So you're not assuming what the best radius is for your environment. You're letting the data tell you that. And the cool thing is, if you sample two very different habitats, or say two forests with really different management strategies, and they have different environments, and you want to know how the birds compare, you can actually generate two different, this is called a function, this shape, two different detection functions for those two different habitats. And then use the 95% interval to estimate your densities. And so it's a much more accurate way to get your data. But there are some drawbacks to distance sampling. One, it's actually hard to see a lot of the birds that we detect. So we must kind of guess where they are. And so practicing, when you hear your birds, practicing actually locating them when you're on your birding outings becomes really good practice, because some birds can sound very quiet and they may be very close. And some birds, their calls and sounds carry much further than others. So getting good at guessing where those sounds are, and then actually measuring the distances. I'll say when I first started doing these distance sampling surveys, I actually had a 50-meter tape that I took out, and I would measure most of the distances. I stopped doing that after a while, because what I then started doing is I started doing the measuring of distances first, and then counting the birds second, and I got pretty good at knowing my distances. There are also some other tools, and I'll talk about in another video, for getting your distance estimates. But even with great technology and tools, it can be kind of hard to take those distances. The other issue that can be problematic with distance sampling is that there's one major assumption, and that is all birds that are at point 0, so here is me, every bird that is at my point 0 is detected. And that is a reasonable assumption in a prairie or on the water. Well, maybe not on the water if the bird's diving under my boat. So let's say on an open prairie, I'm going to detect every bird within reason that is at exactly where I am. But in a tall forest where there's really tall Douglas firs or redwoods, I'm here, and there's trees that are way above my head, and there might be a bird way up there in the top of that tree, and I might not detect it. And that's a flaw. You can do some estimates of what that flaw would be if you know it. And some people will get their detection function out this way, and they'll apply it up this way. And so if their detection function, say, is 100 meters, okay, that's 330 feet. And so they're getting 95% of their observations out to 100 meters, then even in a redwood forest, you might get a tree that's getting close to being like that, but you're probably okay. The problem is when that bird is sitting quietly up in that tree, you still may not be able to detect it because there is intervening vegetation. So it's a flaw, but it is better than all the other alternatives. So for this week's assignment, you're going to practice doing a distance sampling survey. It's going to be the last week we do point counts, and sometimes point counts, just regular point counts, are very overwhelming. This will be an added layer of data to collect, but it's good practice, and it's good to give you a grasp of the sort of range of what point counts are like. And so in another video, I'll review some options for measuring the distances. And something else to know when you're out there in the field that makes things a lot easier. The points, there'll be fewer points than, let's say, a breeding bird survey for this exercise, but they're going to take a bit longer to do, and you have to get out very early to do them. So just budget in time. And my general tips are, don't shortchange yourself on time at your point. Give yourself plenty of time to get oriented at your point. to get a map of your point and to be quiet so the birds become active again. The way you maximize your time in the field is getting between points. So when you're going from point A to point B, get there as fast as you possibly can. That is the only way to maximize your efficiency, because if you're trying to speed through the actual counting piece, it's influencing your data collection. So once you do get to a point, you don't need to just sit quietly, but you do need to give some time to settle things down. And as you're getting close to your point, slow down a bit. Okay, don't scare the birds off, because if you actually scare a bird away that you see, it actually may be quite a while before it comes back. But if you're approaching your point unobtrusively and quietly, there are fewer birds that are going to note your presence or be too scared by your presence. Once you get to your point, get prepared for your point count. Make sure your binoculars are ready. Make sure your recording device is ready, because you're going to record it. And then get your data sheet ready. And I sometimes do this in my field notebook. You can print out data sheets for this, but this is the way I do a point count. I always draw a bullseye, and I may draw 2. I often draw 2, but you might even draw 3 rings in your bullseye. And the middle ring, I don't draw a picture of myself, but I'm doing it for this, is me. Okay, and if I'm standing on something, or I'm right next to a dead tree or a stump, I'll draw that in there too, okay? And then what I do is I actually start to estimate my distance measurements. I will not bring out a tape measure at this point, because that causes more disturbance. So if I'm measuring with a tape measure, I won't do that until later. But I will start to estimate distance using either range finders, or there's some programs that you can use on your phone that will help you with this. They can be more or less useful depending. But I start to draw a map. And so at my furthest circle, I'll draw the thing I can see that's the furthest away. And maybe I can't really mark. There's maybe only in this direction can I see something really far away. And it's, what could it be? It could be some huge, giant towering snag with a big woodpecker hole in it. Okay, it looks funny. It has like a branch that's broken off. Nearby, there may be a specific type of shrub that I note. Okay, and I want to make sure and then I might have some mid-distance things, like there might be some beautiful willow or something over here. There may be a mountain beaver mound, which are in some in the evergreen forest. They're that big now, or a thatch ant mound that you might draw. And you want to make sure you're drawing landmarks in all of your cardinal directions. And I do usually orient myself to north. I find where north is, and I orient myself and make my drawing in orienting things north on the paper, as you usually see on a map, so that I can keep track of things. Once I've done that, it usually takes a few minutes. I might even start listening for my birds. And it is not cheating to start to note, okay, there's a Pacific wren singing over here. Okay, this is one approach people do. Some people don't. You might just make a mental note of that. And there's a warbling vireo over here. Okay. And if I do that, if I start to make mental notes of the prominent birds, not anything flying overhead, but birds are consistently singing. When I start my survey, what I would do is then say, yep, it's still singing. Oops, that one did not sing. I'm going to erase it. And so I start my survey, and then I start entering my birds. I'm putting in 4-letter codes right now. We can give those to you. If you don't know your 4-letter codes, you might just say pack wren. Here's a spotted towhee. You know, and make sure you can kind of do a little bit of chicken scratch as long as you enter that data the very same day you get it. And you spend your 5-minute duration, that's what these are going to be, entering your birds on this map. Okay, once the survey ends, so your timer has run, you stop your recording, you then spend some time making sure that everything is readable, and then measuring your distances to all of these locations. And usually you don't see the bird itself, so you're not getting a measure to the actual bird, but you're getting measured to a huckleberry bush or to a snag or to something that's where the bird is, okay? And so you get your estimates of distance using whatever technology you want to use. You write those in. And so for each bird, you're going to have a number written in for how far away it was. And that's going to give you all the data you need to enter the point count data, okay? Once you're done with your point count, you're going to want to collect habitat data. But I always recommend that habitat data be collected after the point counts are done, because you're always going to be battling time with bird surveys. Bird surveys, they have to happen in the morning. They can't happen much past 9 a.m. and you want to get in as many as possible. So the way you do that is you are careful with your points, but you go fast between them and you don't waste any time. Once you have everything you need, you move on. And so, but you can collect habitat data any time of the day. So usually if I'm walking around with points, I'll walk to the end, finish my points, and then as I walk back, I collect my habitat data. And we'll cover that in another video.